Have I ever told you about the time I was diagnosed with cancer? It wasn't a great day. I was fairly certain that I had a rare form of melanoma before I went into the doctor. So at least I had that going for me. I was somewhat mentally prepared for it. Still, I wasn't all that happy when it got confirmed for me. But this isn't a story about my cancer. This is another type of story. Today's story is about how a movie blindsided me and brought to bear all of the emotional weight that my cancer diagnosis and the subsequent surgeries brought with it. In other words, I was triggered, and that was an interesting experience for me. Not gonna lie, I found myself in a strange place, triggered by a movie. And granted, the movie was about a character who was diagnosed with cancer. But when he went in for surgery, I went in with him. And like I said, all of that emotional weight came down hard on me. I actually had to stop the movie. I had to take a moment. I had to collect myself, and I would come to learn that what I experienced is what is now called triggering. I was triggered by a movie. Personally, I didn't enjoy it all that much. The triggering. The movie was actually pretty good once I got around to finishing it. But even today, several years removed, I still don't enjoy watching movies about cancer. But I know this about myself now, and I conduct my affairs accordingly. I manage my exposures to things that might lead to me being triggered. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's in the managing of my triggers that I find empowerment. I don't feel like a victim of the triggering event. And that's what the point is. The first time you get triggered by something, it's not a lot of fun. It pushes your life off course a little bit. For some people, it pushes their life off course a lot. Because now you know about it, and you have to make accommodations for it. You can't just go on blissfully unaware about that anymore, because you've now been confronted with it. In other words, you know your triggers. It's in that knowledge that empowerment comes, or at least it can. Because that knowledge grants you the power of ownership over your triggers. Nobody else can own them but you. And if you don't own them, they will continue to control you in ways that you can't predict. And part of that realization is that others are not responsible for your triggers. As much as we would like to outsource that, we can't. You and I, we're responsible for our triggers, nobody else. So if someone unintentionally triggers you, that's unfortunate, but it's not necessarily their fault. And yes, there are unique circumstances where you might have explained to somebody that you have a trigger, and then they go out of their way to trigger you. But I'm not talking about that type of person. Most people don't want to trigger anyone unless there's something wrong with them, in which case they might get some sort of glee out of making people uncomfortable. I have no idea. I'm not blind to the fact that people like that exist. But the people I'm talking about are the people who might trigger you in some way, but they weren't attacking you with your triggers, if that makes sense. These are the people who might have been acting in good faith and triggered you unknowingly or unwittingly. These are generally good people. We can't attack them for feeling attacked. When we get triggered, one of the easiest things to do is just lash out unilaterally. That negates responsibility for our triggers. We have to own them. And a little bit of mindfulness goes a long way in this respect. We have to exercise a little bit of psychological self-defense on our own behalfs in these instances. It's called vigilance, and it's absolutely necessary. In much the same way that a person with a severe food allergy has to guard against exposures for fear of sickness or even death, People with psychological triggers need to guard against similar types of exposures. That's an inelegant analogy, but I think you get the point. What it comes down to is that I recognize that I have certain triggers for certain things, and I can't just go into the world at large expecting other people to respect those triggers because they're my triggers and they're internalized. And until I make them external, I can't assume that everybody else is playing by the same rules as I am, because they're likely not. The world becomes a very difficult place to live, even if you feel like you're constantly being attacked. But that's not the world. That's you. That's me. That's our perception of it. And I don't want to live like that. I stay mindful of my triggers and I live accordingly, because the only thing worse than not owning my triggers is when it feels like someone else owns them. And I'm not willing to give anyone that power. You shouldn't be either. All that being said, triggers suck.